SPYR.
She's already laughing at me. Welcome back to Starting Now. I'm your host, Jeff Sarris. This is the show where I talk to entrepreneurs and creatives of all types to reveal the unexpected paths to where they are today. Today, my guest is Erin Blaisdell, and you're just waiting to say something over there. I just feel it.
I got the giggles.
I know. Well, this is the second time I'm doing this intro because for some reason the switcher stopped working, but this is a great conversation. Erin is a professor, specifically. Where is it at? This
UCLA.
I know UCLA, but I was going to say one other thing. Comparative psychology and the Comparative Cognition Lab is where he works at UCLA. But we talk about everything. We talk about the Ancestral Health Society, which is all about the ancestral health diet and paleo. We talk about pigeons and rats and hermit crabs and cognition, and we dive into the science of a lot of things. We dive into his story, how he became a professor, how he found academia as being his passion in life, and where he wanted to go with things. I mean, this is a wide-ranging conversation. I so want to just keep going and talk about so many things that he has experienced and what he's working on. And at the end, there's even an NFT project related to pigeons doing art, cognitive studies and research. Anyway, this is a huge intro, but as she laughs at me again, I know. Without further ado, my conversation with Erin Blaisdell. Yeah, for sure. Have you considered yourself an entrepreneur sort of from a young age?
No, actually, from a young age, no, not at all. Not at all. I was more... My dream jobs when I was a kid would have been actually something I flirted with in college, of being a paleontologist, going on a fossil dig and digging up dinosaur bones, or working at a zoo. I loved animals, so I always thought, working at a zoo, working with animals, especially all the different kinds of animals, would have been a lot of fun. And then the other fantasy I had when I was a kid about my career would be owning a coffee shop that was also a bookstore that only opened for breakfast and lunch. And so you get up, you have coffee, you're serving people coffee, you're reading books, and then you close down after lunch, and then go off and play in the park or something.
Uh-huh.
So it combines kind of my animals and nature love, and then my bookish side, which I love reading books and having coffee.
Yeah, I mean, all of that speaks to me so much. I mean, from the animals to the coffee shop, like my girlfriend Amara actually does like the production live. I don't know if you can see her hand waving in there, but she does like camera cuts and things. And we had talked about doing like a coffee shop in like a VW bus and how fun that would be to be out, like park it by the beach, like I'm in Chicago, we're in Chicago, but like clearly somewhere else, like
LA.
I know, it'd be really nice. Just like Venice, Santa Monica, kind of somewhere around there, have it parked, head out to the beach for a little bit. Like in the morning, you're serving coffee. There's something just magical about that freedom and that connection with people too, because we lose that.
Yeah, there's a farmer's market here, the Mar Vista Farmer's Market, which is right between Venice and Culver City. I live in Culver City, and I go to them on some Sundays. And there are a couple of coffee shops, one in particular run by a friend of mine named Eric. His name is Eric, and he's now has a brick and mortar shop. But he started out as going to the different, the farmers markets here in the LA area and sourcing his beans, flying down to Central America, South America, finding places, finding growers, sourcing the beans, bringing them back. He roasts them and sells them. And both that love of coffee and that love of connection with people I could see he loved it. He loved it. It seems like a great life.
Yeah. I mean, it seems fun. It seems so enticing for sure. And yeah. So was that something you had thought about further? Because you laughed in a way that like having that be something that was on your mind from a young age. Was there a moment where you're like, no, that's not the path. I want to go really down the academic route?
Yeah, I guess I laughed because there was so weird juxtaposition being a zoo or paleontologist person and in a coffee shop bookstore. They seem kind of like extreme odd, like you can't really do both. So weird two directions. But what got me into academia, I guess, was when I went to college. I went to Stony Brook, SUNY Stony Brook on Long Island. I fell in love with it. College was like, oh my God, I found my place. I found where it's all about kind of studying, but it's also about a lot of exploration. And I did a lot of exploration in various directions in college, that really just it didn't change who I was, but it opened up this possible space of who I could be and what I could add to who I already was. And so I leaned into college so much. I loved it so much. I guess that's why I became a grad student. And then I did a postdoc, and then I'm a professor. It means I could stay in college for the rest of my life.
I like
I
that.
Yeah, I just fell into it basically.
What were some of the ways that you were expanding? Like, what were some of the threads maybe that you were pulling at that point?
Some of it was the working in labs. Had a chance to work in a primate lab with living primates, and that's what really changed me from initially thinking to do paleontology, studying the fossils of dead animals, to studying the minds of living animals. Was working in that primate lab. Other things were just the social outlets. I really got to embrace kind of hanging out with people, going to those kind of parties. I never was a partier in high school, so that's where I kind of blossomed as like more social, embrace that social side, experimenting with some of the psychedelics, and with really good experiences with those that were very interesting. And then also I started to hang out with graduate students a lot because I was really focused on the academics. I really enjoyed, and I was going into anthropology, physical anthropology, a study of human evolution, primate evolution, both living and extinct. And I think that it was a small major at Stony Brook, and there weren't so the classes were pretty small in terms of the number of students. I might be in a class with like 15 students, whereas a psych major might be in a class with 120 students. So I got to know the faculty. I got to know the graduate students who were TAing the classes. And so I started hanging out with them as well and going to their parties, and seeing the life of a grad student. So I started to just get a glimpse of that world and how interesting and fun they were having, both between what it was like it's kind of like being an apprentice. You're apprenticing with a master in some interesting topic that you love. And so I saw them getting so much enjoyment out of that intellectually and socially and everything, that I just kind of realized that's what I wanted to do. And so I think those different experiences, there's lots of different ones, but they all kind of fed the same idea that being open-minded, exploratory, and intellectual, but not snobbishly so, but more like just out of a curiosity for the natural world and how it works, and having fun playing with people who also are curious about that.
Yeah,
that's academics.
Yeah, it comes through. Like, you clearly have a passion for it. It's like I can see it on your face. Like, you're excited, like recounting that, which is awesome. Like, so few people have found that. It feels like, you sort of get your job, sit there 9 hours a day, 40 hours a week, whatever, and you just get on that treadmill. But you found the thing, like that area with the flexibility, that really brings you alive, which is awesome. Like, I love seeing that and seeing that in someone. In terms of apprenticeship, which I think is a wonderful point, like you sort of saw that when you were in school. How has maybe apprenticeship, has it played a role in your career at all, like moving along?
Well, it certainly did as a graduate student. So I went to SUNY Binghamton, another of the SUNY schools and that one's in upstate New York. And I did a 4-year PhD in a rat lab, studying learning, memory, and cognition in rats, which is one of the things I now do at UCLA. And the model of being a PhD student is really in a good, if it works out right, it's a master apprentice model. I was in a lab. There were 3 other grad students at the time I arrived, and then some left, graduated, and then others came in during that time. So there's always this kind of like small moving group of like 3 or 4 grad students, maybe a postdoc, and maybe a half a dozen undergraduates who are also working in the lab, and then the PI, the primary PI. I'm blanking on what the term means. It's the primary investigator.
Okay.
That's what we call it. The professor, right?
Uh-huh.
So we are like it's a couple ways. It's like an apprenticeship. One, it's a small team of people solving interesting problems. like trying to do experiments to understand more about the psychological processes in whatever you're studying. That for us, that's what it was: psychological processes in rats. And so I was both like learning from the older grad students; they were mentoring me as grad students, and my Ralph Miller, who was my PhD mentor, the professor, was truly a mentor and friend. And we're still friends to this day. And it's just like he had accumulated so much knowledge, and he had such an understanding of how to extract this knowledge from the mind of the rat. Okay, and how you write papers, how you explain these to your world, to the audience, both writing and speaking, all the things of doing science, of the actual process of being in a lab and doing the science. He was a master at it. So I got to watch it. I got to learn from him. He gave me lots of feedback. We worked together and with the other students. It was just, you're embedded in this really excellent, it's like an incubator in a way. You're embedded in this incubator with somebody who's at the top of their game, and you're learning from them, and they're trying to lift all of the people working with him up, to be like, do this also. So it was just a rewarding process, and I try now to implement that as a PI myself, running my own lab, to be there for my students and to both give them the freedom to run with their interest in the lab to the extent they can, and at the same time to help guide their journey with my knowledge and experience, but also through friendship and learning together. And we're collaborators. One time I remember early on, I was introducing somebody to Ralph Miller, and I said, "Oh, here's my boss, Ralph." And Ralph turned to me and says, "I'm not your boss. I'm a colleague. I'm a friend." And so I that stuck with me. That mindset, that mentality.
Yeah. Do you find yourself then sort of emulating that specific, like you become closer, I would assume, just taking that approach?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. My students, even the undergrads who work in my lab, I asked them to be on a first name basis with me. That's what Ralph had also done. Oh, and Bob Cook, who is my postdoc mentor, very similar type of experience at Tufts University outside of Boston, where I learned how to work with pigeons. Same kind of thing. He was very informal. Some people are more formal, but he and Bob and Ralph were both more informal. Anybody working in the lab, call him Bob, call him Ralph, and could just, shoot the shit with each other about anything really. And that was such a rewarding relationship that I do approach my role the same way.
Nice. Yeah, I want to dive into the rats, pigeons, and hermit crabs. But first, I wanted to ask sort of a broad question. What makes for an interesting problem to solve? Because you mentioned problem solving. That speaks to me innately. Like if I say what I do, it's problem solving. And it doesn't matter if it's entrepreneurship or development or whatever. But what in your mind makes an interesting problem?
Well, that's a good question, actually. I guess all of the different types of problems academically, like in my research that I've faced, it's really boils down to something's interesting. I don't know the answer. Why is something the way it is? But I might have an idea about, a thought, a hypothesis about why it might be the way it is. And it might even be a particularly interesting hypothesis. And so I think what makes that's what defines my approach to problem solving, is that the problems that present themselves are the ones that they're at the edge of the boundary of our knowledge, right? And so we're getting close to that edge with the prior knowledge that we've accumulated reading other people's research. And then we realize, we don't know why this works the way it does. But you might have this like insight about, there's this theory out there, there's this idea that's an analogy to something else I know that suggests an insight into why something is the way it is. And we can design an experiment with like an experimental group and a control group or something that actually can, if it works correctly, it'll provide an answer, some insight, maybe not the complete story, but we're getting there, making steps. So I think that's really the attractive thing about problem solving in science.
Yeah, and you said maybe not the complete answer. is there ever a complete answer in science? Because I know this is debated, it's like, oh, it's a theory of evolution. And it's like, well, yeah, but that is the terminology of how we say those such things.
Right. No, it's very true. It's never complete. In a way, our knowledge can never be complete about, unless it depends on the level of the question. Like you could say, what compounds does a particular flower make that are aromatic, that attract insects? And you might discover completely everything that they do. And you might get to the point where there's really nothing new to discover with that very particular question, right? But does that mean that other flowers that also attract pollinators aren't using other kind of compounds? Well, no, we don't know. We have to study that. And so there's always seems to be the answers are always incomplete. The knowledge we gain you're shining the flashlight, you're illuminating parts of the room you haven't seen before. But all that does is show you that there's even a bigger room than you realize, or more rooms beyond it.
I really like that analogy. That is, yeah, because you're just, really, that's just all it is. Like, in the end, science it's relatively young, right? And, I love that shining light on things and seeing that there are more things to shine light upon, and then creating those studies as we go. I like looking at it that way, just because I know people want that sort of, I don't want to say mathematical answer, but that like binary, it's just like 1 or 0, like this is true, it's false,
right.
There's no gray area, but that's just it's not how the natural world works, or our knowledge of it.
That's right. That's mathematics works that way.
Yeah.
Because we could do proofs. There is no proof in science. There's evidence that supports or fails to support a hypothesis or a theory, but there's no proof. You don't prove something in science.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So then rats. I know it's rats and then moved into pigeons and also hermit crabs. What was that spark? Like, I know you were working in the lab with sort of with the people previously with rats, but what is it about rats that cognitively speaking are so fascinating? Because I saw that you said something along the lines of living animals were more interesting than dead humans when it comes to brain and cognition and things, which I think it's a really good point. I imagine it's vastly different. So what was it about these animals maybe specifically?
And that was a tongue-in-cheek kind of comment. Dead humans are very interesting, and dead humans used to be alive and be very interesting in their own right. But to get your question about why rats, it's funny. I have my in-laws are like, studying rats, like he's a psychologist, only studying rats, something simple like that. Why not humans? What most people don't realize is that a rat, the brain of a rat, the processes that brain implements is vastly more complex than any AI or thinking machine we've invented, any kind of computer. Even our most expensive and cutting edge, amazing technological advanced machines we have now, computers and algorithms and programs and all that, pale in comparison to the quantitative complexity of a rat brain, even of a fruit fly brain, actually. Because you have to realize that every single neuron is a nonlinear processor. It's not just a binary 0-1. We think of that with the action potential. A neuron fires and it shoots and it tells the next cell, okay, I just fired. And here's it passing on that information, right, from one cell in the network to the next neuron in the network. That's the part that we can measure relatively easily. But neuroscience has really found out that the intracellular processes, every single neuron is listening with dendrites. These are these little projections that come out of the neuron, is listening to about 1,000 or more other neurons and is gathering information from each one in a nonlinear fashion. So just if you think of that analogy, a computer operating is a linear operating machine. Each cell in a neural network is a nonlinear operating machine of vast complexity. Scale that up to the level of a fruit fly brain, thousands of neurons, a honeybee brain, or millions of neurons, and trillions of neurons, like in a rat or a human brain, you start to realize there's so much we don't know, even just how a rat brain works. there's so much we don't know that is very much worth studying. So that's kind of one response I can give to your question. Another response I can give to your question is, well, why rats? Why not like primates? If they're more closely related to humans, maybe their behavior is more human-like. What we fail to realize sometimes is that despite the differences that are true, a macaque or a chimp will be much more closely related to a human and probably more similar psychologically than a rat would be to a human. At the same time, there's a vast amount of the psychology and cognition that the brains produce of a rat and a human that's similar. In the same way that I have 5 fingers on my hand and I could grasp an object, as the top of my water bottle, and manipulate it. You'll watch a squirrel or another type of rodent or a rat. They do the same thing. And the way that the hands work is functionally pretty similar. They don't have opposable thumbs, but in many other respects, they're grasping organs of 5 digits, and there's some kind of coordinated process. There's a homology, as we call it there, meaning the way that the rat hand or a squirrel hand works and the way a human hand works, there's still a lot of similarities, despite some differences. That actually is true of the brains too. There are all these different parts of the brain. The human brain, we know, the parts that do memory, like what we call the hippocampus, and parts that do more decision-making and behavioral regulation, like your frontal cortex. There's the visual cortex in the back, which is where all the information from the eyes initially goes and it gets processed. Auditory cortex. So all these parts, right? Cerebellum, that's like about motor control. You look at the rat brain, they have a hippocampus, they have a frontal cortex, they have a cerebellum. Functionally, there's a lot of similarity. There's a lot more similarities than differences. And so if we want to study basic processes of, well, how does learning and memory work? How do inferences work, like a causal reasoning type inference or a spatial inference? So I've been from A to B and I've gone from B to C, and now I know how to go directly from A to C, even though I haven't traveled that route before. That's a spatial inference. How does the brain do that? You could study all these things in rats as well as you could do it in humans, because essentially there's largely the same kind of processes. These are homologies.
That is very interesting. Would you say it would be in any way easier or harder to study in rats versus humans? So I'm thinking about that, like that causal thread sort of thought, where do you almost, not to diminish the intellect of a rodent, a rat, say, but being that we have, I would assume, like emotions and a level with our cognitive function that could maybe impact a study. Is there sort of anything with that between the two where almost there's a little bit of a simplicity there versus humans?
It's true. You're right, actually. And that's actually, I think, both the weakness and the strength of non-human animal work, is that humans have this extra thing of language, shared culture. We build knowledge based on what we've accumulated. A rat or any non-human animal starts out in the world only knowing what it knows and only acquires understanding of the world through its own observations and observing other animals, other conspecifics, for example, doing their thing in the world, like in a social group. The rats can actually learn from each other to some degree, but they're not talking to each other. So there's this real severe lack of deep knowledge that's accumulated historically that humans have. So that means it's a weakness in the sense that the kinds of abilities they have will be diminished relative to what humans can show. But that's the strength. And that's where I really think the animal research is so valuable, because if we're studying, let's say, and I like to study the things like in animals that are pushing the boundaries on what we thought animals were capable of doing in terms of their cognitive processes, like more high level stuff. I like to investigate those, because I think this is where an animal research can be very valuable, because when you're studying some kind of really advanced cognitive process in a human, well, you can ask the question, well, of course a human can do this kind of cognitive advanced process. Let's say episodic memory. Let me give you an example. So episodic memory is, for example, if I ask you, where were you yesterday afternoon? Did you go out or were you at home? Can you tell me now what you did yesterday afternoon?
Yeah, I was at home.
And what did you do at home? Was anybody with you?
Yeah, Amara was with me. We were watching football on the couch. So
Okay.
yeah.
You have a memory of that. Specifically, you were on a couch. There's a place. You were doing something, watching football, and you can close your eyes, and you can even picture that, probably revisit that memory.
Absolutely.
That's episodic memory. There's some people in the field of cognition, people who study, we call them human researchers. We mean people who study human cognition as opposed to animal researchers. We don't mean little animals doing research, but people who study animals to understand them. So the human researchers, there are some that would say, yeah, animals really can't have episodic memory because in order to do that, you have to be able to ask them a direct question that requires language as a response. And you can't do that in an animal, for the most part. So
sorry, can I pause for a second?
Go ahead.
For the most part, what does that mean?
What I meant was that because there are certain species that have been used where they've been trained on certain aspects of human language, such as the sign language or lexicon boards, like a board of icons that chimpanzees and bonobos have been, and gorillas also have been studied. And then there's a parrot. A colleague of mine, Irene Pepperberg, studies parrot cognition using parrots that have been trained to both understand human speech to some degree and to respond with spoken words, English words. And so using those techniques, you can start to ask questions and get verbal responses, although it's still it's at such a base level compared to what humans could do. Yeah. That's why I said for the most part. It's a good aside. So, but the point I want to make is that the reason that a rat could be so interesting and valuable as an animal to study is because this high level, like human type cognition that many people think, well, only humans can do that, or it's something that we know we could study easily in humans. To what degree is that process dependent on language versus we access it verbally, but language is not really necessary? It's actually an ability that predates the evolution of language. And so it might be found in non-humans. It's just that you can't answer that question in a human because the human already has language. So what you need to do is ask the question of a species that doesn't have language. And if you see the same basic aspects of that cognitive process, this advanced cognitive process, then you could say, looks like language isn't necessary for this process to operate. It might be assisted by language, but is actually the precursor of it, or it exists in some form, even in a non-human. So the non-human research is necessary to ask those kind of questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tighter control, I guess, because you have one less variable that would come down to the language and the passing on of knowledge that way. It's one of those things. There's someone, I don't remember his name, it was a while ago I saw it, but he is a blind YouTuber. And he was describing, like, he talks about sort of what it's like to go through the world. He does sort of tongue-in-cheek little things where he's going to buy a car and things. But he's like, what color is the car? And they're like, red. He's like, I've never seen red before. What's red? And they're like, well, the color of a tomato? And he's like, I've never seen a tomato. And it's like, you start to realize there's these senses, language and the senses, like, really intertwine so well. So importantly, like, it's vital for something. So I could imagine in animals, you pluck out a little bit, and then it's like, okay, now we can really sort of narrow down this intent and focus.
That's a great example, yeah.
So, yeah, it's just, I find all this very fascinating. This is the problem. I feel like we can completely go down all these rabbit holes because I just find science infinitely fascinating. And then when it comes to cognition, like humans, animals, everything, that I know this is going to be such a surface level on everything, because I also want to talk about AHS and everything else that you've done.
I know. Every podcast interview I've ever done it's so unique, even though it touches on a lot of the same themes, because you can go so far in each one. Yeah,
definitely. So rats, pigeons, hermit crabs. Is that
I don't use the hermit crabs anymore.
okay?
During COVID, I kind of gave them away as pets because we just didn't have the staff to work with them anymore. But they were interesting. They're cute. I had a hermit crab as a pet when I was a kid, so I've always kind of liked hermit crabs. They're easy to keep in captivity, and yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I imagine though the brain is substantially smaller in them than the other animals.
It's smaller, and it's an arthropod, right? Like insects, crustaceans, spiders are all in the phylum Arthropoda, and they haven't independently evolved their brains compared to vertebrates like fish and mammals, birds, and reptiles. So it's an independent evolution of a brain structure, a brain system, but there's a lot of similarities just because they have to function in a world. So they become designed to be similar in many ways, not maybe to look similar, but to the network diagrams. When you start digging into them, they actually realize there are a lot of similarities.
So when you say they evolved independently, what is the? It's just like further down the chain of just evolution, or what do you mean by that?
No, from a separate starting point. From the base starting point from about 550 million years ago, when all the modern phyla of life are divided. So there's the animal kingdom. And all the animals we know, when you classify them, there's like vertebrates. Those are animals that have a vertebral column. And there are all these different type of invertebrate phyla. There's mollusca, right? So there's simple ones like clams, all the way up to the complex ones like octopus. That's a whole phylum that kind of evolved from this 550 million years ago, kind of the Big Bang, the Cambrian explosion, they call it. The Big Bang of all modern animals started then. And so one line led to the evolution of vertebrates. Another line led to the evolution of mollusks. Another line led to the evolution of arthropods, the insects, spiders, and crustaceans, and all that. And so the actual brains in each of these types of phyla evolved independently. They didn't start out with a creature that had a brain, and that's why everything else has brains, because they inherited it. They started out from a basal type of animal that only had the distributed neural network, like a nerve net. And then like early on in mollusca evolution, mollusks were now on their own path evolutionarily, separated from the other phyla. All of a sudden, an animal evolves where they have some kind of central organization to that neural net. A ganglion forms, and then that ganglion becomes more complex as evolution takes over. So basically a brain gets built through the evolutionary process of natural selection. That brain getting built was independently in arthropods, vertebrates, and mollusks.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And just for people, because I know we think evolution, natural selection, I like the phrasing natural selection because it like sort of better articulates it. Could you sort of explain just in layman's terms is the basic of what natural selection is?
Right. So evolution just means change over time, essentially. And it's the process by which we think that life forms, new species evolve, and then over time speciate themselves to even more species and get more increasingly diverse. What natural selection is the mechanism or the type of process that Darwin had discovered, that he proposed as the solution to how that happens. And to this day, that's become the dominant view and has failed to be disconfirmed. Mm-hmm. And there's overwhelming evidence that this universal process of biological change over time.
And basically, it's a selection process for maybe a more fit species?
Yeah, so the way to think about it is there are three ingredients to natural selection. There's phenotypic variation, meaning that any character trait, height, skin color, eye color, a behavior, a digestive process, anything, is a trait that varies. You can take 100 individuals of that species and you measure that trait. So let's say height. Some are tall, some are short, most are in the middle. So you get a bell curve distribution. So you have a phenotype that varies within a population, like height. You have differences in. All right. So the second part is that there is a genetic component, a heritable component to that. So the tall people carry genes for being tall. The shortest people carry genes for being short. They're not maybe 100%. There's an environmental impact, a contribution too, but to some degree, there's some genetic contribution. So that's the second ingredient. The third ingredient is now in an environment, some levels of that phenotype are more fit to that environment than others. Let's say tall people in a particular environment have a selective advantage, meaning they leave more progeny, more offspring than shorter people on average. If you have that happening because of the environment for whatever reason, if you have that, then generation after generation, because the people with genes for being taller are going to leave more kids, there are going to be more genes for tallness represented in each subsequent generation within that environment. That's how the environment is selecting for a particular trait that has a genetic contribution.
Yeah, it's so fascinating and makes perfect sense. And very broadly speaking, obviously, because there's so much more, so many intricacies that would go into it, but the broad strokes of it make perfect sense, and why some animals are in some places, they're not in others. I think in New Zealand, there's flightless blind birds or something along those lines. It's like that wouldn't survive in most places because there's predators. But if there's no natural predators, then these selections can happen and continue on, which is wild.
That's the key, is that the environments can change. Either the environments themselves over time can change, or the organisms, a group of individuals, might migrate to a different location. Like cave fish, which originally came from fish that swim in streams, somehow got stuck in a cave, and in the cave there's no light. They lose the ability to develop eyes over many, many, many generations. There was no need for it, so there's the selective pressure to keep eyes. Any mutation that might arise that might damage the ability to develop eyes in a population of fish that live in a stream where there's light. They need those eyes to survive, to see predators and avoid them, to find food. But in a cave environment that's completely pitch dark all the time, there would no longer be a selective pressure on that. So the environment, they move into a different environment. Now you can get evolutionary change.
Yeah. Very fascinating. And that does sort of lead us in then to ancestral health and how you found like ancestral health, just like super broad, 30-second like description of what it is. Then sort of I want to dive in a little deeper.
The idea of ancestral health and the reason we use that term is because it emerged out of the paleo concept, like paleo diet concept, but it's more broad, because what we mean by it is that anything that's part of your ancestral history can influence what your health is going to be at any given time now. So typically we think of that as your evolutionary history. So we're humans. That's one part of it. But we're also mammals. That's another way to look, part of what shaped who we are and how we thrive. Part of it is our individual development, like when I was conceived and born and grew up. That development during my own lifetime is part of my own ancestry, if you think of it that way, very broadly speaking. Also, ethnic groups, different ethnic groups have different accumulation of different kind of genes that had been selected based on a particular environment. Like think of light skin versus dark skin, based on and with latitude. Like Scandinavian versus sub-Saharan African. That's evolutionary factors that drove those differences.
Yeah. So then ancestral health being like we are looking at all of these factors from our ancestry. I like the localized look, because I hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, it makes perfect sense. But looking at those factors and the things that play in, and then trying to maybe return to where we naturally are should be.
So you're right. That's the second part of it, is for the health part of it, realizing that all of that ancestral states that we've gone through lead to our current health being impacted by the kind of environment we're in. So and a simple example would be somebody who's lactose intolerant, who is not able to drink milk as an adult. If they move to a Scandinavian country and, like, let's say milk is always on the menu, they're going to have digestive problems a lot of the time. That's because there's an evolutionary mismatch, another important term, between what their bodies optimize for based on their history and what their current environment is. Another one might be people of African American people of African heritage with darker skin living in northern latitudes have a tougher time making vitamin D from sun exposure, because the sun is at a weaker, more of a steep angle, and is not as efficient at inducing the vitamin D production in the skin. So they tend to be more vitamin D deficient, and that's an evolutionary mismatch as well.
Yeah. So you're the co-founder of the Ancestral Health Symposium, is sort of the broad company, I guess, umbrella, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, we started as a symposium, and then we formed a society that operates the symposium.
Gotcha. Yeah. So what brought you there then from maybe your research, or what did you discover? What were the threads you started pulling when it brought you into this area?
Good question. So I actually was collaborating with Seth Roberts, the late Seth Roberts. He passed away a number of years ago. He was also a rat researcher at UC Berkeley, not UCLA, but UC Berkeley, not too far from here. And we started collaborating on some work. And he had this side interest of both self-experimentation and blogging. And so he would blog about books he's read. He'd blog about websites he's been reading about, like with human evolution and its relation to human health. And he started linking to and talking about on his blog, like Gary Taub's Good Calories, Bad Calories book, which I then read because he blogged about it, and linked to some other like paleo type websites, including the one by Mark Sisson, Mark's Daily Apple. This is before the Primal Blueprint book that his first publication came out. So I started going to these websites and reading Gary Taub's book and reading about how low carb, high fat diets, especially ketogenic diets, seem to actually have a lot of health benefits. So I thought, let's give this paleo and ketogenic diet approach a try. I was curious, and so I tried it out. And lo and behold, I actually lost weight, although I was never heavy. I was always kind of a thin person. But I didn't realize around my midsection, I had a little bit more punch than I thought. And my face was actually, I realized in retrospect, had already become a little puffier just over time, accumulating, the systemic inflammation that a lot of people walk around with. And that kind of leaned out. I kind of lost all that extra body fat. I started feeling a lot better. My mental energy was like always top and feeling amazing. I loved it. And the clincher was I put into remission a genetic disorder that I've had all my life.
Really?
So it's one that runs in my family. It's called, I'll say the word and I'll use the acronym after that. The genetic disorder I have that runs in my family is called erythropoietic protoporphyria, EPP. Okay. We'll call it EPP. So EPP, a type of porphyria, is it's a metabolic disorder. I won't go into all the details of it, but the symptoms are, for EPP in particular, is very strong sun sensitivity. I had to avoid sunlight all my life. You can go out for a little bit, but you start feeling this graded response, like in the exposed skin, the face, the hands especially. You start feeling this burning and itching sensation. And it's very different than a sunburn. A sunburn, like you touch it and you feel like, oh yeah, I got a sunburn. This is like a constant, it's almost like you've ever had a wind burn, where you had like a real strong wind exposure and it leaves this really like always consistent burning sensation on the skin. It feels a lot more like that. It's really uncomfortable. It went away. About a year into doing this diet, it complete remission. I can go out in the sun. I had to be careful not to get a sunburn. In fact, now I don't even get sunburns very often because I get sun on such a regular schedule that I built up a base tolerance. So that clinched it for me. I could put a genetic disorder into remission through diet. Yeah. Okay. Had to start a symposium about this.
Definitely. And I'm sure the cognition too, being that is your area. Like that is something that, like, for me, that was one of the first things I noticed. Like I wasn't having that afternoon crash. I was just much more, I felt more mentally acute. Like I could focus better. I could retain knowledge better as well.
Exactly. Yeah, once you feel like that, you feel amazing again. You don't want to give that up.
Yeah, it's your new baseline because we all like find our
Yeah.
baseline. Like even if it was, we talked about working earlier, and like if the baseline is I am depressed from 8 to 5 and I want to get home, it's like this is just normal. This is what I expect. But then when you get out and you look and you're like, I'll never go back there. And like the same with our health, it's like we're getting better sleep and we're more fit. We're more like physically fit. We're more capable, maybe of walking, running, jumping, throwing, catching, lifting things. Like it just sort of starts
I'm more
to happen.
capable now than I was in my 30s physically.
Isn't that
Definitely.
wild? Like, and it's just, it's going back to nature. It's really going towards where the science is heading and evolving and learning and what we're uncovering, just like your everyday research that you're doing with the animals. But this is the human animal, the human researcher, I guess, like sort of part of you.
Turn the experimental arrow on ourselves. Right?
Definitely. So then when you're like, I need to start this, around what year did you start the symposium and sort of what were maybe the first steps there?
Yeah, so I started this whole journey in 2008, and that's when I read Good Calories, Bad Calories and started reading all these paleo and more nutritional, evolutionary nutrition blogs. 2009, I was hanging out with my good friend Brent Pottinger, who went on to get an MD from Johns Hopkins. But before that, he was also in this space, had a blog of his own, and was paleo and low carb and blogging about these kinds of ideas. And so he and his brother went to UCLA, so he would come down and visit often, and we would hang out. We went to this one symposium in 2009 at UCLA, and it was called New Directions in Physiology. And we thought, oh, cool, they're going to talk more about how, we could use lifestyle factors to help tweak our health. And each talk that we saw, it would be the person talking about something where there's a real lifestyle factor with the kind of disease process they might be talking about, like sarcopenia or something like that, the loss of muscle mass. And they would have a genetic mouse model that had they called it Mighty Mouse. So I remember one of the talks, it was by this guy who had this genetic mouse model that had a genetically modified to produce much more of the type 2 fast twitch muscle fiber. And so these mice gained muscle mass easily. And he was looking at, and he wanted to study the markers of like, what are the physiological, chemistry and physiological inputs that create that process. But of course, at the end of the talk, their conclusions were, now we have new targets for psychopharmacology. For pharmacology, new drugs to discover. And Brent and I are looking at each other like, oh God, what the conclusion should be. Now we know why resistance training should be prescribed by doctors, some heavy lifting, maybe once a week or twice a week, because now we know that it's targeting in a natural way these systems that are there waiting for those stimulus inputs. In the natural environment, in our ancestral environment, we had those kind of stimulus inputs. We were lifting, we were carrying, we were climbing. And so instead of looking for drugs to solve the problems of poor lifestyle, we should use that knowledge of it's a lifestyle problem to make a lifestyle fix, and with all the health benefits and none of the bad side effects that drugs have. And so we said to each other, we should just have our own symposium where we have the same kind of talks about this new, area of physiology and this new thing we know about. And at the end of the talk, it's like, oh, now we know how to fix this with lifestyle, rather than now we know what to go for with drugs. Yeah. And that was the genesis of the idea of the Ancestral Health Symposium, which we finally had at UCLA for the first one in 2011.
What was that lead up to make it come to life? Because that is a big undertaking, any sort of event like that. And especially when you need the presenters, you need the people who are doing this research. And especially at that time too, it was harder to find. Like now it's right. Like everyone knows about like keto and low carb and all these things. But at that time, it was yesterday in our evolution, but it's like almost hard to fathom how outside of the box this was just a decade ago.
It was. And I tried first to go through UCLA channels, there are certain groups on campus. I pitched the idea of can I run a symposium and you guys can sponsor it, your group, with me being a faculty here. that's about this. And I kept getting pushback. Oh, it's about bloggers, because we were talking about inviting bloggers, people from outside academia. And they all like, no, that I don't think that's really good. It's not a good idea. You don't know what you're going to get. And I got all that pushback. So I decided I'll just rent a space on campus myself. I could rent it as an outside entity. We could do that. A donor came in, one of Brent's blog readers actually came in and said he'll front the money if we can rent the space. And the other thing is that Brent himself was actually very well connected. He was the Pied Piper. He and I sat and came up with a list of the dream team. Oh yeah, like Rob Wolf, Mark Sisson, these kind of people to bring to the conference, Chris Kresser, and all these people who had started blogs already, but didn't even at the time have their books yet. A lot of these people, but they were starting with their blogs and they were becoming known. Maybe some podcasts early days, and we came up with like a list of 20 or 30 people, and Lauren Cordain and people like this who was an academic publishing in this area, and Brent just went through and emailed everyone, said, we're planning to have a symposium. Would you want to come and speak? About 90% of the people said yes. We were like, whoa, within like 2 weeks, we had most of them, people were like, yeah, we're on board. Let's do it.
Nice.
And so we were amazed that we got such a turnout, such a big response. And so the planning ended up being pretty easy because we had all the people already agreeing. We had a space. We had somebody helping front the upfront cost. And so we put it together. We had a big kickoff party for all the presenters at my house. It was funny because we still have pictures somewhere. I think you can find them on the internet now, of that first party when all these people most of them were meeting each other for the first time in person.
Nice.
And it was like in my backyard, in my house. My house was so packed. There was like 60 people in my house. And my house is a small house. It was LA. And so I remember one time having to go from the backyard to the front, from back of the house to the front of the house. It was easier to walk outside. To go in through the mass would be too much. It was also, our house is a shoeless house. All these shoes on the front steps, traveling down the front steps. It was great. There was this energy there. The conference itself was so much energy because all these people for the first time talking, sharing ideas, talking to each other, who we've known each other on blogs and podcasts, but we're in person, talking to each other, having these conversations, presenting work. I remember at one point, Tucker Max was actually there, and he turned to me and says, I've been to a lot of events. I've never seen an event with this kind of energy. This is next level shit. Like, you got to bottle this. You have something here. Like, it's like bottle that lightning and do something with it. So that's when we initially were thinking it would just be a one-off event, but it was because of the success and the thirst and hunger for it that we decided, let's try and do this every year or every other year.
Yeah. What would you say makes that energy? Like, I know the first one, there is a magic to the first time you're meeting these people that you really respect online, that you know so intimately well, but you meet them face to face. Like, that was like South by Southwest for me. Like, I've been in the brand development space for so long, doing all these things. And another team I was a part of, we threw a party at South by Southwest in 2010, 11, something like that, to like everyone could meet the team and blah, 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 because there's a community there.
Yeah.
And meeting people for the first time just changes things. It's funny because we do so much online now, but like when you're in person, it's like, no, this is real. But in person, it's like, now this is real.
I've noticed that too, even with the Web3 kind of community, starting to meet people in the NFT space in real life. And like, there's that same, it's just like in the Ancestral Health Paleo kind of communities when we first met. You're right. There's something magical, extra dimensional about the in real life experience that is not replicated. You have these really rewarding relationships online, but it's an ancestral health kind of thing, right? It's not the same as in real life. It's like what our evolution expected us.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that what you've learned from ancestral health from the symposium, do you think that can be applied to other areas? Because like you mentioned Web3 NFTs, and notoriously, those conferences are not good. Like, from everything I've heard, I don't know, maybe there's some that are, but I know certain ones, they're like, oh, we have 800 speakers. We have this, we have that. And I'm like, you and I know there's not 800 thoughtful, experienced people who should be up there speaking, because there's a lot of different factors that are going into all of this. Are there maybe some learnings you have from your experience where you could maybe see that applied elsewhere to other verticals like Web3?
Yeah, I think so. I think what I'm actually very hopeful about with Web3, because I think it's one of the best than blockchain technology in general. I think what it's going to do, what it promises to do, is to enable distributed, not in real life, but online connections to be closer to what we expect from in a real life perspective, from a real community of people that work together in real life. I think it's actually bringing Web 2 doesn't really provide as much of that because it's so top-down structured. But we know that natural human behavior evolved in these small egalitarian hunter-gatherer band societies. And so our evolved psychology and our social modules and everything operate best in a more egalitarian, playful, open context where things aren't all hidden behind paywalls and closed doors and boardrooms and everything. That's a more modern, that's a mismatch actually, and that causes a lot of harm in the world. I'm actually hopeful, and I hear this kind of from a lot of people in the Web3 space, that that the Web3 is actually, if anything, going to enable a larger networks of distributed people, distributed over space and time, to tap more into that more natural kind of dynamic that our minds expect. So that's why I'm hopeful about Web3, actually.
Yeah, I find that very interesting. I never thought about it having almost like an evolutionary lean to it.
Well, I think of human societies as being, so we talked about optimal. Did we talk about optimality before? I think a little bit.
I'm not sure. I don't think
not.
optimality.
Okay, I was talking about with a student earlier today. Okay. Maybe I'm crossing my lines. But all right, so we were in a very stable type of environment, social environment, a hunter-gatherer band society, a small group of 20 to 40, 60 people that all know each other, all work on solving the same problems of, we got to raise our kids safely, move around safely, hunt and procure food, and have fun. And those kind of societies operated for at least 200,000 years of Homo sapiens existence. And then about 10,000 years ago, different parts of the planet, of the world, you started getting this shift to a sedentary agricultural hierarchical system that's departed from there dramatically. And now that's what like our modern societies are like. We don't really have the kind of freedoms in our lives that a hunter-gatherer would have. Or the playful nature of the way we do day-to-day operations aren't in a playful way. In hunter-gatherer societies, they actually are. And so what I think with the Web3 is that it's now enabling that kind of at a larger scale that we currently live in. We're going to be stuck living with this large-scale society. But now I think what happens is we've optimized, I'm getting back to optimality, we've optimized over 200,000 years, evolution has optimized human band society and our mind working in that. There's this dramatic shift, and now cultural evolution is now going through the process of, well, that doesn't work, that doesn't work, that doesn't work, and getting better and better at finding solutions that work better. And this Web3 thing is actually one of those next phases of cultural evolution that might make the world, a global economy, start to work better.
Yeah. What are the things about it that you think that you see the potential in specifically?
I think because it's an open ledger is the basis of it, that now it's going to be much harder to hide anonymously and anonymity. There's going to be much more clear transparency in the way things operate. That's one of the critical things, because in a small scale society, there's much more transparency. And so you can evaluate what your peers are doing, and you can, support or not support them based on their actions. Are they going to be pro-social, supporting society, or anti-social and selfish? This in our modern society, there's so much selfish behavior that's enabled by non-transparency. So I think that's one of the keys, is that by being transparent, it's written on a blockchain, every transaction, decisions, that they're searchable, viewable, and open. So I think that's going to help keep people and entities accountable for behavior, so that they could be checked the way they could in an open society.
Yeah.
And hopefully, I know there's a lot of, with the SEC and other kind of entities in the US, for example, trying to figure out where to regulate the use of this technology. I think that hopefully the evolutionary process will lead us all to a direction of a more libertarian type, what do they call it? I just listened to a podcast where they were talking about this, where it's oh gosh, and I'm blanking on what I just wanted to say. Sorry, I'm pausing here.
It's all good.
Yeah, I was listening to the debate on the recent Bankless podcast between the SBC. What is the guy's name that started? Oh no, I'm blanking on all. I just listened to it all the other day too. What is it? I should just probably give up on this. It's not coming to me.
It's all good.
Yeah, it's all good. Yeah, sometimes I just have too many conflicting ideas, and some are outcompeting others. But the idea was that and I know that an example came up during this discussion on this podcast of, let's say that I, as an American citizen, want to send to some poor Iranian woman who is like struggling to survive under this regime there in Iran, send her money. And I could do that with Web3, with blockchain. You could send cryptocurrency, unless it's regulated. The ideal would be that there isn't regulation on freedom of transaction between consenting individuals. I think that is what we need to protect. And I think that's the promise that blockchain can deliver. It tears down the barriers. It tears down the walls between societies, between borders, between nations, to allow people to be people and help each other. It can always allow people to hurt each other from distances too, but hopefully that's the kind of thing there will be the old mechanisms of punishing people by not working with them anymore, ostracizing them. That's what worked in the old days. Hopefully that can work in the new days as well, and other solutions too. But I think ultimately it's about the freedom to interact with others without some authoritarian middleman saying, no, you can't do that. You can't talk to them. You can't send them something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it breaks down the barriers, but like you said, depending on how it's regulated, that can really change things if it's taken in certain directions. Yeah, it's very interesting. And we encountered each other through community, through like other people. Like James has been on the show, James Costa, and so we encountered each other through that. How have you?
And Joel Reed.
Yeah.
Because I hold a couple of Clubby Bears, and
nice.
I also hold some of James Costa's Clubhouse archive tokens. I've been big supporters of them, big fans of what they're building.
Yeah, and
so it's great. I
wanted to talk sort of about community there, because I know you guys have like a tight-knit community of, I want to say like, this might sound wrong, but like high-powered people. Like I consider you, James, Joel, like you are high performers, driven, like you have done a lot. And I think that's one of the things that's really like, it's beautiful to see I feel like how I'm saying this is not going to come across right at all, but the grouping of people together, finding like-minded individuals, finding people who really can help one another, because we have deep, rich skill sets and experience, but diverse. I mean, James is in fashion. Like that is a very far space from where you are in academia, but there's still that overlap.
Yeah, and I think you're right. We're like-minded, passionate about certain things, curious, exploratory. I think that's right now what's attracted a lot of the Web3, like to cryptocurrency folks, DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, and the NFT community, the various NFT communities, and the artists. That's the other thing I'm passionate about, is this, to see what the technology of blockchain with and NFTs in particular can provide artists, which is like it's the first time ever an artist could get royalties on their own work, and for secondary, third, tertiary sales of their work. That idea just is mind blowing to me, and exciting, right? So it's fun to see that we're all just kind of finding each other, in the same way that I started finding people in the paleo world back in ancestral health world back in the day. It's the same kind of thing going on now with the Web3 and NFTs, which is fun because now my two worlds intersect. My animal cognition research and now the NFT space actually have intersected for me personally.
Yeah.
Which is exciting.
Yeah. So that, like, you have a project, Pigeons, NFTs. Could you just sort of explain that just a little bit?
Yeah, it's just one of those serendipitous things. Like all great things in life is due to serendipity, just an accidental happening. So it was a year ago, it was in May 2021. So it was about, actually, let me just go back. So summer of 2021 is when I started really learning about NFTs and getting excited by them and starting to collect a little bit, especially on Tezos, because there's a lot of real funky, kind of fun artists on that blockchain. But also I actually collected on, if you see this shirt, nice. I collected this is an NFT actually that I made a shirt from Debbie Taya. It's one of the human JPEG. I got this one early on. Nice. It says pigeons are punk rock doves.
I like that.
Because the punks and then pigeons. So it was just a fun vibe. And so I started listening to podcasts and going on Twitter. I've been on Twitter a long time, but that's where I discovered all this NFT space was a community was hanging out, and could find out about different projects and start learning and learning more about it. And I was talking about this to my students, my grad students, back in like September a year ago. And I was saying, and I made this little offhand comment like, oh, it would be fun if like we can have our pigeons make art and then we can mint them as NFTs and sell them. And one of my students turned to me and says, and got her phone out. It's like, I want to show you something. She says, actually, one of our pigeons made art a few months ago. So it turned out, so the way we run our pigeon experiments, we put a pigeon into a box, about this big, and there's a touch screen on the front of the box, and we present visual stimuli. And let's say we have a discrimination, like peck the green one, not the red one, and you get a food reward, stuff like that. And that's our basic behavioral training procedure. And we usually put a pigeon in a box. They have their programmed procedure that we give them. At the end of the behavioral task for that session, the program closes down and it just gives them a black screen. Well, somehow this pigeon at the end of its session closed out that program, pulled up paint, and actually made markings as some kind of visual stuff on the screen. So this student saw this. She went to open the box to get the pigeon out. She saw this artwork on the screen on MS Paint, and she's like, that pigeon just did that. So she got a picture of it, showed me on her phone, and I was like, oh my God. That's when the idea hit me. We actually can pivot to start a project in my lab to study how pigeons can make art and what can they do with it? Like what can it tell us about human art versus pigeon making art? Are there similarities or differences? We could start a whole project, multiple experiments, a long term project to start exploring that. We started that. At the same time, the artworks that they produce, we can curate some of them so that nice looking ones we could actually mint as NFTs and sell them, where 100% of the proceeds go back into supporting the animal research in the lab. So it's all just, none of it goes to me, none of it goes to other people. It goes to supporting the research itself. Nice. And that way the pigeons are kind of helping to participate in the process of doing research and getting the money that helps keep the Pigeon Lab expenses covered and all that.
Yeah,
so that was
wild.
the idea.
It's a closed loop.
Exactly. And it's so and the thing is, like, that's what Web3 blockchain type technology is perfect for. That's the kind of need case. Just like with artists getting support for their work rather than waiting till they're dead before the stuff makes money, and dying penniless. I mean, I'm exaggerating. Not most artists aren't that put out by it, but still, it's not easy for artists to make it.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same is true for scientists, especially science that is not the cutting edge, biggest, sexiest tool. That gets usually the most funding from the big federal agencies. My kind of research uses kind of old school technology, but we're asking cutting edge questions about the mind of an animal. And so it's harder to get funding for that. So I thought this is a perfect use case of the blockchain technology.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, and just sort of even to call back to the beginning, you're shining a light on things that are giving us more things to shine a light on. So it might not be the area where money is being thrown at, because it's not like, oh, we want to know about this thing to see what else we can learn. It's like, we want to know X, Y, Z. Here's a bunch of money. Like, it's an exploratory endeavor. So yeah, that is very cool. I love how it's the closed loop. Are there some things you've started to learn with regards to art versus like pigeons versus humans, or is it still too early? Sort of where are you in that process?
It's still very early days, but we have already kind of got some glimpses. One thing we see is that there tend to be individual differences. Because we have about 23 pigeons that have now gone through and given the opportunity to make art on many occasions. And we see that for the pigeons that have done more than just a few, some of the pigeons aren't that motivated. They might have made a few and then they kind of never really do anything. And we don't feed them for doing this. We don't give them reinforcement. They get their food from doing other experiments. This is just extra on the side. And so it's just up to them if they're interested to engage. And
if they want a side hustle.
They basically, yeah. Some don't. They're not too interested in it. So, okay, they haven't really done much. But there are others that have like 20, 30, 40 pieces that they've done, like 40 different sessions, where each session they've created something. And some of them, and for the ones that are more prolific, some of them tend to peck a lot of bursts in like a certain area and a lot of bursts in a certain area. And there are others that are a little bit more kind of, they're distributed. And another thing we've seen is that one of our pigeons is in a task where he's in two experiments, the different experiment and then this art experiment. In the other experiment, the point of the experiment is to peck really fast to get a target. So it's a reaction time experiment. We then take that same bird after it's done with that reaction time experiment session, and we just give it the blank canvas and a couple of tools that are open already, and it'll make a few pecks, stands back, make a few more pecks, stands back. It's more like this. It makes some engagement, it makes some strokes, stands back, evaluates, goes back in and does something else, like the way an artist kind of works. And I was talking to Pindar van Arman, who made BitGans, famous for all that kind of generative AI kind of artwork, and talking to him about that. And he said, that's very much like what Paul Klee, the famous painter from the early 20th century, said that the artistic process involves is this kind of act, observe, critique, go back, act some more, that kind of feedback loop. We see that in some of our pigeons when we're looking at video footage we've collected, and it's really fascinating.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. So many questions I could ask. Just one more thing, because I don't want to take too much of your time, but are you almost seeing, or I guess it's early, but the ones who've done a bunch of pieces, are you seeing maybe a growth? Are you seeing a change from piece to piece where there's anything that they're taking from each experience? And again, I know it's very early, so there's not a ton of data, but
that's a good question. But right now, I honestly can't answer that. I don't know. There's a lot of variability day to day, even within a particular bird. I'm not sure if I've seen too much a growth, as you would put it, like a directional kind of change. There's definitely stochastic change, but I think it's at this point, I can't say it's more than stochastic or just kind of like the random fluctuations in their how much they want to engage on a given day.
Uh-huh.
But one of the things we do want to do is there's so many things we want to do. Gosh, we have a list a mile long. One of the things we really want to do is, because when you think about human development, when kids start, I have had two kids, so I knew when they were like a year and a half, you give them a crayon and it's just like, scribbling on something. By the time they're about 3 or 4, then they start making little face, like a face, two eyes, like a circle, 2 eyes, and a line. And that's like a person, right? Everything's like real basic, but they're gaining that representational capacity for their art, rather than just purely abstract or random. We want to see if we can train pigeons to copy from an image. For example, real basic, like if we give them a line like this on the screen, and then there's a canvas, so the image and then the canvas, and we reward them for making lines and not for doing anything else, will they start to learn that when they see a line to do that? And then we turn the line this way, what will they do? Will they automatically generalize and do this? Is there any copy paste kind of idea in the pigeon? Like, can they learn to do that? And once you get them, if we can do that, if we can get them to basically do some kind of copying influenced by the image, then you can give them a more complex image and see, what do they do spontaneously? Will they start to pick up on many of these elements in this picture and recreate it? That is, can they sketch?
Yeah.
So there's just so many kinds of questions that we can ask of art in pigeons.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is so fascinating. This has been such a enlightening and fascinating conversation, but I don't want to take any more of your time. I feel like we'll have to chat again, whether it's maybe one day in person we can make that happen, but there's so much to talk about. Yeah, I find all of this endlessly fascinating. But where should we send people to? I don't even know what would be best for you. Follow along, check out the NFT project, a little bit of everything, whatever works best for you.
Okay, I'll just give 2 things then. There's my laboratory research website, which is actually, it's called pigeonrat.psych.ucla.edu. And if you can't remember that or didn't scribble that down, just Google Aaron Blaisdell, my name, and that's always the first link that comes up, is that my lab website. So it's easy to find. But the other ones for this pigeon project specifically, we came up with the site pigeonart.xyz.
Perfect.
So that's where we talk about this project. We also have a link to a place where you can go and mint your own. So we have a bunch of the paintings, digital artworks already available. And so you can go to that pigeonart.xyz, and there's a mint site there that you can then click on that. It'll take you to, it's actually I wrote it down because I can never remember. Pigeonart.net, NET, is where the mint site will be. But you can get to there from pigeonart.xyz. Take a look. Mint one.
Perfect.
Support a pigeon.
Yeah, I like that. But yeah, thanks.
Oh, again. We do. And I'm sorry, before we close out, another goal of this, we're going to do this soon, is to reach out to zoos and animal and wildlife shelters or places like that. And once we have the app that we've created for allowing pigeons to do the artwork ready to share, we want to share it with zoos and other like nonprofits involved with animal welfare and endangered animals and things like that, to allow them to use it with their animals to then generate art that they could sell to support them, like a zoo. Imagine a zoo supporting their panda bear exhibit by the pandas making art, and then people can buy that, things like that, raise awareness. So we're hoping that that's one of the drives we want to get. If we can get the funding for the project now, then we can develop that app to the point where we can make it available for the wider world.
Yeah, very interesting. And even, I'm sure this is the part of even the webcam just kicking on, and you're then able to, if they're open, to then analyze data. I know it's not like controlled studies, but there would be more data for people to look into from different animals, different regions, different times of day, whatever it is. That's right. Very fascinating. Oh,
excellent. Well, this was a lot of fun.
Actually, one second.
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, actually, here, hold on.
Oh.
Here, wait, let me switch the camera over to Amara because she has a question.
I was actually curious. Do the pigeons have any color preferences?
Interesting. Here, I'm going to switch it to the FaceTime there for you.
Oh, okay.
So I think you might be able to see her now.
Hello.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Hey there.
Nice to meet
Well,
you.
nice to meet you too. Color preferences. We haven't studied that yet, and we haven't systematically given them choices for colors yet. That's another thing we want to do is give them, load more of the choices onto the Pigeon and off of the app that we've developed. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was just curious because I know that like humans, we have our own color theory and everything. So I was just curious if there was a proclivity toward like brown or green for trees or something. Like, I don't know, very naive thoughts, but yeah, just curious.
Well, pigeons are rock doves. That's the actual, like, we call them pigeons, but they're from the Mediterranean region. And
nice.
the typical term for them is a rock dove.
So then your
because
shirt's
they
even
nest,
funnier.
which is why that's why I call it pigeons are punk rock doves.
I love it.
That's much more of a play on words there. But because they're cliff nesters.
Oh, okay.
And that's why they poop on statues and sit on statues and on buildings, because we designed all these cliffs, and the pigeons are like, oh, we'll move right in.
Right.
So I don't know about trees as much as maybe gray stone.
Yeah,
Maybe
that
they
would be
prefer.
interesting. Yeah, varying shades of gray, maybe. You could have 50 shades of gray pigeon collection, possibly.
Yeah. Although I have to tell you, pigeons, like most birds, are pentachromatic.
What does that mean?
It means they break the visible light spectrum into 5 different colors.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know
Yeah.
that. Okay.
We're trichromatic, right? Like we have 3 primary colors: red, green, blue. Red, green, blue. And then we create all the other color space out of mixtures of that.
Right.
So pigeons
Ooh.
actually have 5. So we can't even imagine what their color world looks like, really.
It's going to look like an acid trip.
So how do you know that then? That is such a... Sorry, I'm going to pop the camera back over here.
Sure. It's from the physiology. We know, like, for example, in primate eyes, in the retina, they're in the cones, which are the color sensitive cells. There are 3 types. There's the one that maximally responds to light in the red wavelength. There's another one that's maximally sensitive to light in the green wavelength, and a third in the blue wavelength. So that we know that, and in people who study the cone cells of birds, like pigeons and other birds, there are 5 different types. There's a maximum tuning to 5. There are 5 different frequencies. Each one is maximally tuned to one of those 5.
That's wild.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
We're going to have psychedelic pigeons.
We can have a whole nother podcast on psychedelic pigeons.
I love it.
There you go. I want to thank Aaron for joining me on this episode. I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did. I was geeking out a little bit on the science of things. And over there, what are you thinking, Amara? Did you have fun?
Yes, I had lots of fun. I was just looking at the camera for dramatic effect. No, I had a lot of fun. I had so many questions about the pigeons making art. I was like, I want to know all about their process and how they feel about it and what their motivation is. It's a really neat premise, though. I mean, you know me.
Their motivation.
Yeah, I've studied art history for forever, so yeah, it definitely was. It struck a little something in me. I don't know. It's very interesting.
Yeah, very fascinating. And we could talk about so much more. Like, I definitely think whenever we get out that direction, we're going to have to grab coffee or dinner with him and just pick his brain a little bit more if he's up for it. Because that was
I had
very
like
fun.
A million different questions. And then I was like, okay, don't like harass the poor man. So,
but yeah, anyway. Thanks again for tuning in, for watching the show. If you like the episode, give it a thumbs up, hit that little subscribe button, and if you share it, it means a lot. But I think with that, we will wrap, and she is about to sneeze. No. Sneeze or yawn? What is happening? Anyway.
I'm experiencing something.
Anyway.
This
has been started now. I'm Jeff Sarris. This is Amara Andrew.
Hi.
And we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bless you.
Thank you.